Welcome to Sikhcast, brought to you by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.
Introducing Paigham-i-Goya, Expression of Love, new translations of a selection of ghazals from Bhai Nand Lal Goya. Today's podcast begins with the recitation of Bhai Nand Lal's ghazal in Persian, followed by a new English transcreation, the result of a unique collaboration between Dr. Fatima Fayyaz and Dr. Nadhra Khan of Lahore University of Management Sciences, Damanpreet Singh, writer and graduate student, and Inni Kaur of SikhRI, followed by a discussion between Daman and Inni about the beauty of the ghazal and the transcreation process.
دین و دنیا در کمند آن پری رخسار ما، هر دو عالم قیمت یک تار موی یار ما. ما نمی آریم تا به غمزه مژگان او، یک نگاه جان فزایش بس بود در کار ما. گاه صوفی گاه زاهد گه قلندر می شود، رنگ‌های مختلف دارد بت عیار ما. قدر لعل او به جز عاشق نداند هیچ کس، قیمت یاقوت داند چشم گوهربار ما. هر نفس گویا به یاد نرگس مخمور او، باده های شوق می نوشد دل هوشیار ما.
My angel-faced beloved holds the reins of the temporal and celestial worlds. These two worlds are worth just a single strand of my beloved's hair. We cannot bear the allure of that gaze. One rejuvenating glance would be enough for our lifetime. Sometimes a Sufi, sometimes a Zahid, at others a calendar. Our unfathomable beloved has many tints and shades. Who, except the lover, would know the worth of beloved's red gems? But our eyes that shed pearls are aware of the value of rubies. In the memory of beloved's intoxicating eyes, Goya, with every breath, our wakeful hearts sip on the nectar of longing.
Guru Fateh, this is Inni Kaur in conversation with Damanpreet Singh and about ghazal number 2 from Bhai Nand Lal Goya's collection Divan-i-Goya. Welcome, Daman. It's so nice to have you here with me again.
Yeah, it's nice to be back.
Great. You know, before I forget to tell you, Daman, we've been getting some really interesting comments about the ghazal. Quite a few people have said they are going to be joining us on this journey, and they're looking forward to the next podcast. But there were two comments which were particularly interesting, which I wanted to share with you, that people were really appreciating the context that we were, putting around these ghazals, and the nuancing of the translation and why we chose certain words. So they're appreciating that. And I know in this one particularly, this ghazal has taken us through quite the journey where the two of us, and actually the four of us, were on different wavelengths. Mm-hmm. And I think on this particular ghazal, let's talk about the translations that we have put out there. Mm-hmm. But the ones which speak to us a lot closer. So it'll give the audience a taste that there's never one right way to translate.
Yeah.
Because we come from different spaces, mm-hmm. right? And our understandings are different. So I'm going to share with you the first couplet, mm-hmm. and then let's talk about that one. The first couplet is, My angel-faced beloved holds the reins of the temporal and celestial worlds. Both these worlds are not even worth a single strand of my beloved's hair. So, Daman, when I read that for the first time, particularly the temporal and celestial worlds, the first thought that came to my mind was Miri Piri, that this beloved holds everything in his or her hand. But then the second line, what said, both these worlds are not even worth one strand. So then what is worth more than these two worlds? There is something more than these two worlds. And that's where I began to think about the only thing that is more in my mind is love, which transcends this. So talk to me about your understanding. What did you, when you read this and we worked on it, what did you think?
Yeah, I think your interpretation is one I would agree with. And I would just add that there is, in this couplet, there seems to be echoes for me of the couplet, one of the couplets in the first ghazal, where he's kind of describing his coming into existence. And he's saying, there was no sign from sky nor earth, but love for that brought me into existence. I don't know exactly how we ended up translating it, but that's the general translation. And there's again this sense of the vastness of one's love for one's beloved transcends all understanding and all, even how we can fathom the most vast way to fathom the universe, which is both the temporal and the celestial. Even that does not capture for him what this relationship to his beloved captures. And it's not even that his love for his beloved is equivalent or beyond. It's a single strand of the beloved's hair is not even worth the temporal and the celestial. So there is a great sense of vastness that comes in this couplet that I think is really powerful, and I think also sets up this ghazal, which we'll talk about, but this is a bit different from ghazal 1, because in this ghazal he's describing in detail his relationship to his beloved in very intimate terms. And this very powerful couplet in the beginning, where he's setting up this contrast between the temporal and celestial worlds and the single strand of his beloved's hair, really sets us up for going on this journey with him in ghazal 2.
So, Daman, in the first ghazal, we did not use the word beloved. There was no beloved in there. But here in this ghazal, we have used beloved. I know beloved comes in the first line. So can you talk about that, particularly in the context of Persian poetry? And how does the word beloved appear, and what are the connotations and the symbolisms of that word?
So, yeah, that's a really good question, because so what's interesting here is that Nand Lal is developing and appropriating and using a trope of Sufi poetry, which often refers directly to the beloved and is often about the relationship between the lover and the beloved. So we can see here that Nand Lal, again, as we discussed last month, is deeply aware and also has mastered the ghazal form. He's clearly aware of the tropes that are used in ghazal poetry of the beloved and the lover. And he is, of course, in his context, which is his position in Guru Gobind Singh's court, is not referring to what a Sufi poet might be referring to when they talk about the beloved, but is actually both describing, in my interpretation, his relationship with the Guru Gobind Singh, and also his relationship to Ikongar, or the divine, right? And I think each ghazal can be read in both ways, and they are one and the same. So this is I'm seeing this as his very clever and powerful and beautiful interpretation of this classical Sufi poetry form, which tries to figure out or tries to discuss the relationship between the lover and the beloved in his context of Guru Gobind Singh's court. Now, to refer specifically to the process of translating this couplet, if we look at the original Persian, we'll use the word beloved throughout this ghazal, but really in the original Persian, it only shows up once, and the word that's used in Persian is also a word we have in Gurbani, and also a word we have in everyday Punjabi, which is yar, which can popularly mean kind of friend, but also means one's beloved in Persian. And the word yar is used in the second line, and we've also moved it up and introduced it in the first line for the ease and convenience of the English reader who isn't aware of this trope of the beloved and the lover in Persian poetry. If we were to translate the first line word for word, we would say something like, "My angel-faced one holds the reins of the temporal and celestial worlds." And for the ease of interpretation and understanding, we've translated one as beloved to really make it clear to the English reader that this is a key word in this ghazal that will continue to reappear, even though in the Persian, it's really implied more often than it's actually stated directly.
Right, Daman, there was another word here, while we translated this as angel, it actually means a fairy, right? Can you speak a little bit to that?
So the word is buddy, which we also have in Punjabi and other subcontinental languages. And the word angel-faced or buddy is referring to kind of Persian mythology and has a particular history. And again, for the purposes of an English reader who might not know all of the context, we've used the word angel, which is, I think, more readily understandable to the present day reader. So that was that was also a word that, as you remember, was like hotly debated among the four of us in terms of how we should go about that. But ultimately we settled on angel because I think that is a word that an English reader is more familiar with and can understand the image of an angel-faced beloved more easily, perhaps.
I struggled with the second line of this couplet. Both these worlds are not even worth a strand of my beloved's hair. Or there was a very great push for these two worlds are worth just a single strand of my beloved's hair. There is and here it is. We could read it actually in both ways if you wanted to, that these two worlds are worth just a single strand, or these two worlds are not even worth a single strand. So the depth of it is how one looks at this relationship and how one puts it out there.
Yeah, and again, it does. That was another debate that occupied a lot of our time among the four of us, and like you're saying, really points to both the nuances in the original Persian, but also I think at some level the debate over whether we should say these worlds are not even worth a single strand or just worth a single strand is also, I think, partially just like who we are as people, right? And what speaks to us more. And that can even change for me in a given day, right? Like in October, I might have advocated for another line, and then this week I might have advocated for another line depending on kind of where I am. So I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind when doing any sort of translation work, is that it really is a process of interpretation that is just going to be different for every individual depending on especially when we're talking about something so intimate as one's relationship to the divine, and we're translating a poem that is so intimate and represents someone's very powerful experience with the beloved, and someone as important to the Sikhs as Bhai Nand Lal. So it becomes very complicated.
Yep. So let's, I totally agree. In my translation process, I look back to what I translated a year ago, And I just say, how could I have done that? That's not what I mean. But that's the understanding, the depth, and you learn from it. And I think it's, in a way, it's good to acknowledge it too.
Mm-hmm.
So for the reader and for the listener and for the reader also to know that this is a process. There's nothing set in gold, set in stone here. And it's a journey. So let's go on to the next couplet. We cannot bear the allure of that gaze. One rejuvenating glance would be enough for our lifetime. So here, we used a different word for gaze because it was really, in the original, it was the fluttering of the eyelashes and how do we bring that? The symbolisms was there. But I love the intensity that we cannot bear that gaze. When I encountered this, it took me back to the dialogue with Pai Mardana, what he was having with an individual. And the individual asked him, how do you see, where is the Guru? And he said, there's the Guru. And he's talking about Guru Nanak Sahib. And the individual looks and is blinded. He said, all I see is light, radiant. I cannot see. And and Bhai Mardana says, that is not the way to see the Guru. You have to look below, you have to put your eyes down and begin from looking where the earth is, where the feet are, and then work your way up, because then you will be able to absorb the radiance.
Mm-hmm.
And it was such a powerful thing for me at that time, that the eyes also need to be able to absorb that radiance and see that. And how do you see the beloved? It's only when your eyes are lowered. You rarely can you look into that eye,
Mm-hmm.
and because it's so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and talk to me about that, because there's another line before we go on to the next line, because there's a phrase there in the second line that I really want to get into.
Okay. Yeah, I think. Wow. Yeah, I think that is a really helpful way to think about this couplet. That story about by Mardana, and I think there's two things that I think are kind of important here. Is that there is, first, like you were saying, there is a great sense of warmth and radiance, and maybe even stronger than warmth. And there's a heat that comes from the beloved's gaze that is at some level just absolutely unbearable, but is also something that one is longing to understand or longing to meet that gaze, even as it's unbearable. And I think that kind of tension of something being unbearable but also kind of irresistible is really interesting. And I think there also comes through in this couplet a sense of remembrance and or maybe longing, right? Because there's a sense that the gaze of the beloved is too radiant and too much to bear right now. But one small glance, one encounter with the beloved for this lifetime would be enough, suggesting that, I'm aware that whatever my life is right now is not all it is. All I need right now is a glance or a glimmer. And I might just stay at gazing at the feet of the Guru in this lifetime, and that is actually fine. Which I think is really interesting, given that we know that even one strand of the beloved's hair is not worth the temporal and celestial worlds, right? So there's an interesting way in which he's trying to figure out his life and what its limitations mean, and kind of how there is this sense of longing and this sense of knowledge that there will be some sort of reunion, and it's not possible because it's unbearable, but also not necessary to try to understand the full allure of the gaze in this lifetime.
Mm. Daman, explain to me the word we chose was rejuvenating.
Mm-hmm.
Rejuvenating glance. I mean, I would probably would like to have written one life enriching glance, because this word in Persian. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. Yeah, this was another debate, right? um, the original Persian is John Fizaish, which literally would mean, something that increases one's life, or something that is increasing of one's life. And the original word that we chose here was resuscitating, which was, I think we all decided, was the wrong word because it really means you're coming back from death. And here the implication really has nothing to do with coming back from death, but actually, yeah, one's life is augmented by this glance in this lifetime. So we went with rejuvenating, which I think is maybe a word all four of us are differently unsatisfied with, right? To be completely frank, it was really difficult to figure out this word. And I think maybe, like we were saying, maybe in 4 months, if the four of us talked again, we would want another word, and that's fine. But I think, it captures a little bit of what that might mean, because there is a sense of refreshment or a sense of kind of feeling enlivened by this glance that I think comes through with the word rejuvenating that might be close to the original in Persian.
I know, because in Bani it is really that it's only when you feel the grace that you live.
Mm.
Otherwise, you exist. So I'm wondering whether this is that same, you're existing, but with that one glance, then you actually live.
Yeah.
That was my thought when I was coming to it. I mean, then the the Persian poetry, the Sufi poetry, I mean, they use the expressions and the metaphors and the symbolisms. I mean, this is not something for the common man, right? It really you have to have you have to be learned while it is sung. I mean, in South Asia, I know most people recite these things, but do they understand them, the symbolisms and the metaphors that they are, particularly, and also understand them according to your mindset. I mean, particularly the one with the fluttering of the eyes. I mean, that's very visual, and yet we changed it to gaze. And I think we've lost something there.
Yeah.
We couldn't I couldn't have put we couldn't have put the radiance of that fluttering eyelashes.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a difficult line to translate, because if we went word for word, yeah, like you're saying, it would be something other than gaze. It would be, yeah, right, like you're saying, the fluttering of the eyelashes. And yeah, I think it's interesting because I think I often think about how um, in many English speaking cultures, and maybe I'll talk about the American context because that's the one I know the most, there isn't a culture of kind of oral recitation of poetry like there is in a lot of other cultures, including, in Punjab, there is a culture um, of poetry that I think is, a popular culture of poetry that really, there is a sense of like a shared vocabulary of poetry in some ways. And maybe, we can talk about how that's being lost and so on. And um, I I often wonder when when we try to make these sorts of calls in terms of what an English speaking reader who might not have any of that context, which is really, I think, important to emphasize, is when we're translating these, we're trying to translate it for someone who has no idea who Bhai Nand Lal is to come to this ghazal and still get something from it. No idea what even, Sikhi is and come to this ghazal and get something from it. So for that reason, sometimes a lot of things feel like they're getting lost because we have to kind of be very careful to not make things too difficult to follow or obscure. I would say obscure, right? Because
Right.
yeah. Yeah, so I think that was a really interesting conversation, and this really line does capture that tension for me. Um, so he's engaging a form that the ghazal remains very popular in Iran and also in South Asia, but we're not. So there, I guess there's two things. We're not translating for a primarily South Asian audience who would already have this context, and also we're translating very complex imagery that would have been readily understandable in Bhai Nand Lal's context in the court of Guru Gobind Singh, where there was this very, vibrant poetic culture. And we want to retain that and demonstrate that at some level, but also provide the reader with something that I don't want to say easy to understand because that's condescending and that's not what I mean, but is not unnecessarily obscure and difficult to find a way into. And we want to make it so that the ghazal is easy to find a way into and hopefully prompt like more exploration and like hopefully I think the idea is that people will want to ask questions, how are these choices made? What does this word mean in the original and so on? And that opens up a lot of powerful things in terms of interpretation and in terms of engagement with Bhai Nand Lal's words.
And hence the podcast. I know you were hesitant, and I was like, no, definitely, we need a podcast because there's so much there we cannot explain. And, to have these conversations and to have the listeners and the readers in on the process, I feel they become part of your journey and they walk with us on this. So let's go to the next one. And I love that. And Daman, I'm going to really ask you about these. So sometimes a Sufi, sometimes a Zaid, at others a Kalandar. Our unfathomable beloved has many tints and shades. I mean, I am understanding of the word Sufi, Zahid, and Kalandar, but this is really about a relationship. This is about the relationship, or maybe the, I talk about that in love, there are many dimensions of love. There is reverence, there's the devotion, there is the caring, the kindness. And here I see that sometimes in that relationship, I'm a Sufi, and sometimes I'm a Zayed, and sometimes I'm a Kalandar. Because my beloved has so many qualities and so much that I that that I'm absorbed in them, and it's
Yeah.
okay. So
Yeah.
talk to me about that. How are you seeing these?
Yeah, this is a really interesting couplet for me because I think, so the importance of the word Sufi Zahid and Qalandar makes it really interesting, which notably we've not tried to translate. And if one looks at the website, you will see a footnote and you can click on the footnote for an explanation. But yeah, we did not want to even attempt to translate these words. Um, so my understanding is that, a Sufi, a Zahid, a Qalandar are kind of three different modes, like you were saying, of trying to figure out one's relationship with the divine, right? So a Zahid, notably, is kind of an ascetic, but is kind of following the rules and is perhaps not yet, as isn't quite the wandering dervish that the Qalandar is, who is, immersed deeply with the divine. The Zahid, there is still some sort of implication of kind of being. There's an implication of being. So there's several implications, I think. So one translation that I've come across for Zahid is the zealous ascetic, who's really devoted to the rules and really devoted to figuring out what's right and what's wrong. And I would maybe not use the word zealous, but there is a sense of kind of being by the book in this way. Whereas a Qalandar has very much, is free, is liberated in a certain way, and is wandering and immersed with the divine in a different mode. But I think what's interesting here is that, and the reason I'm hesitant to say that Zahid means zealous aesthetic is because if we look at the next line, it's, as you were saying, it's our unfathomable beloved has many tints and shades. So Bhai Nand Lal to me isn't suggesting that to be a Zahid is to be less than a Qalandar and one is aiming to ascend in some ways up a hierarchy, but is actually saying, whatever the relationship is with one's divine in a given moment, whether that of a Sufi, that of a Zahid, or that of a Qalandar, that is one's relationship with one's beloved, and that is fine, and is actually maybe even more than fine, but is actually part of what it means to be in this world. I kind of was thinking about kind of how often I think as Sikhs we have a sense of, one must be in Jardi Kala, for example. That's something that we hear all the time. That's something that's very important to us as Sikhs. And I think sometimes it might even become like if you're feeling enraged or sad or not in Jardi Kala, you're maybe doing something wrong, or maybe you've lost your connection to the Guru. And I think that sometimes is the implication, or at least like in my life, that's felt like what I've heard in different contexts, whether like directly people speaking to me or just kind of my observations. And sometimes it feels like there's a push to get out of whatever rage you're feeling or whatever sadness you're feeling to get back into Jardi Kala and accept hukam, right, etc. And I think that this might be a similar sentiment where there is this sense of like, it's okay not to always be in Jardi Kala. It's okay to not always feel like feeling optimistic. And that doesn't mean you've lost a connection with the Guru, but that's actually part of being alive and part of one's relationship with the beloved, and the many tints and shades that one's relationship with the beloved takes. So that kind of was my interpretation. And of course, this is another thing where it's like, as a courtly poet of the Guru writing, some scholars have argued that Bhai Nand Lal's ghazals were primarily actually for a Sufi audience that was the audience he had in mind. So there's a thing here that I'm doing that might actually be kind of irresponsible, where I'm taking what was written for a particular audience, perhaps, right? That's what the scholarship suggests, and trying to understand it in like a contemporary Sikh way or context, kind of what it means for me as a Sikh today. So there could be, I think, another interpretation of this couplet where we could think about what it means for Bhai Nand Lal to be talking to Sufis using the language of Sufi, Zahid, and Qalandar, and his relationship or understanding of the beloved.
Right. I mean, on the love journey, I mean, there are many emotions that come through and many feelings, and as the relationship develops, you experience those and then you articulate them. You cannot articulate something which you've not experienced. So to me, it is, I mean, I know it was only when reverence entered my life that in my love, that I was said, oh, there is a component of reverence as well. Before that, I didn't know that. So, it was, reading that, just, it felt kind of like okay for me. I said, oh, I think I know what he's saying, but not quite knowing. But, because you always interpreted it for yourself,
Yeah.
it's just human nature. So for the next one, we go on to, who except the lover would know the worth of beloved's red gems, but our eyes that shed pearls are aware of the value of rubies.
Mhm.
So here now, we have this one was a killer.
Yeah.
Because there were metaphors, and there was the lal, and how do we translate red, because knowing fully well that in Gurbani red is the color of love, lal rang, and we know when this lal rang charda hega, that means you're immersed in this love. And then comes this lips, and so all these, and then you had the pearls, and you had the rubies, and you had the gems, and it was just, it was like kind of like I was entering a magical world.
Mhm.
Then I thought about it, and I said, this pain of the pearl, our eyes that shed pearls, when our eyes shed pearl like tears, it's when we are really in pain. when longing is so intense. And we can still see that beauty in those tears, because those tears are shaped like pearls. And yes, they are, so for me, that became that connection. And I'm sure there is, I mean, gems are symbolic in spiritual language. I know, Bhagat Kabir talks about them, and he reminds us that the ruby, in one of his shabads, he says the ruby is described as the warm luster of the heart. He describes the ruby as, he used ruby in that essence, that depth, that redness of the heart is there. So talk to me about when you, I know, I know some of the things what you have said about this, but I'd love a listener to have your, what you feel about it and where you are coming from in this one.
Yeah, I think this one is, similar to the couplet with the gaze. I think there was quite a lot of debate here. And because the depth of the imagery, as you're saying, is such that it's hard to figure out exactly how we should translate it. So something that I guess there's three things that are notable, kind of three words that are notable to think about in this couplet. So the first is the beloved's red gems that we have in the first line.
Mm-hmm.
The original word here is lal, which in the Persian would mean gems in general, but also often means specifically the ruby, and often is used as a metaphor for the beloved's lips.
Mm-hmm.
So we thought about, should we say the beloved's lips? Should we directly just make it less of a metaphor and just directly say that? Or should we say the beloved's red rubies? Or should we say the beloved's red gems? And as the reader can see, we ultimately settled on beloved's red gems, both to convey the possibility of Nand Lal referring directly to a ruby, but also hopefully people will listen to this and know that there's also an implication of the beloved's lips, because I think in English that wouldn't be something
Right.
that where my mind would go. And that this was a context that one of our team members, Fatima, was explaining to us in terms of the word lal in Persian would have all of these different implications. So this is another one where, maybe in 2 months we would want to change it or whatever, right? But I think then there's the other thing is that in the second line, we actually do have the word rubies for yakut, which would be translated quite directly as ruby in Persian. So for that reason also, since he's using two different words in the same couplet to refer to the red lips, or in one perhaps to refer to the red lips and the other perhaps not to, right? This is all up for interpretation. We've used the word red gems and the word rubies to kind of give a sense of that there are different words being used in the same couplet to refer to something perhaps similar. So that's something that I think is notable in this couplet. And I think it's also interesting, like you're saying, that there is, again, this deep pain and longing that he's referring to with the pearl-like tears. And it seems that even those pearl-like tears, or the eyes that shed the pearl-like tears, are still, he's trying to figure out kind of what that longing means for his relationship to the beloved. And I think he's suggesting that even those eyes that are shedding pearl-like tears and are longing so much for the beloved have an understanding of the beloved, have an understanding of the value of the beloved, and that longing itself is something beautiful for him. The last thing I think that I would say here, though, is that, and this I think is true of all of his ghazals, and I think is something that his ghazals really teach us, is that there is a great sense of the aesthetic.
Yes.
And a great sense of imagery. And here we have the jewels. And, in other ghazals, we'll have the seasons, right? Spring will come and colors. And I think that is something that And of course, that also comes in Gurbani, the sense of the aesthetic and beauty and the importance of beauty. Um, but I think that is also notable, is that there is a very consistent sense of the importance of the aesthetic for Bhai Nand Lal. And, of course, it always is important to remember that he was a courtly poet surrounded by beautiful things. So what can we learn from that kind of, the importance of beauty?
Yes, but who, it's only a lover would know the worth of a beloved's lips and long for them,
Mhm.
right? And do anything and shed the pearl-like tears in that longing and that waiting. And now we come to the last couplet. In the memory of beloved's intoxicating eyes, Goya, with every breath, our wakeful hearts sip on the nectar of longing. And here, for the intoxicating eyes, I mean, the original is Nargis, and Nargis is a flower, but yet the symbolisms is really for the beautiful eyes, and it's these intoxicating, dreamy eyes of the beloved that Goya, with every breath, is waiting so that his heart can sip the nectar of longing. I would have liked to have, instead of that nectar, put the wine of longing.
Mhm.
This connotation of wine, wine has a different connotation, and yet in Sufi poetry, there is jam.
Mhm.
You're always going to the mekana, to the
Mhm.
tavern, and drinking. So this was kind of like for the four of, I think, I don't know whether we could have put wine there, but this is what would have, I think I would have liked to have put that wine there.
Yeah. Yeah, this was another controversial one because, like you're saying, there is narcissists that we ultimately, instead of using the imagery of the flower, we just translated it as eyes,
Hmm.
and then nectar instead of wine. And then the other controversial word, which I think maybe to a reader is confusing as to why it's controversial, but sip versus drink was also of great controversy for the four of us because, we were kind of debating whether he's saying that his wakeful heart is kind of slowly, gently sipping this wine or nectar of longing, or is he saying that his wakeful heart is taking a big swig of the nectar of longing, and what those are two very different things. you
Mm.
know that's the difference between impatience and patience, and both interpretations I think work because in the first line there is a sense of every breath. He's kind of talking to himself here, where he's saying every breath is in this memory of the beloved's eyes, and one could easily interpret that to mean that he's very kind of slowly, calmly sipping this nectar of longing. But we also have seen him be very kind of tumultuous in other contexts, right?
Hmm.
We've seen kind of the impatience and the longing and the pearl-like tears. So one could also interpret this. Given that the Persian word is the general word for drinks, it was unclear to us what exactly the translation would be in English for sip or drink.
But here, Goya is while he's referring to himself, he's also speaking to all lovers because he used the word "our wakeful heart," right?
Yeah.
So it's. I think that's the form of the Persian poetry, the way it comes out, the ghazal form, where you become larger and then you take on the persona of all the lovers and you speak like that.
Yeah. And this, I think, is also maybe actually something that gets lost in the English. Because in Persian and also in Punjabi and other kind of subcontinental, but even other languages, maybe English is the exception here. I would have to check. But, one could refer to yourself using the second person plural. And that's pretty common. And it has a certain implication, right? And we've talked about this also in terms of like, what kind of feeling comes through when you refer to yourself as Asi or whatever in Punjabi, but Ma in the Persian.
Mhm.
So it really is something that gets lost in English because our wakeful heart doesn't have the same dual implications, where he's referring perhaps to all lovers, but also could be just referring to himself in the second person. And I guess in English, the only equivalent we have is like the royal we, which is not at all what the implication is in Persian or Punjabi. So that's a very interesting thing that I think like gets kind of lost in translation in that way. And both interpretations, I think, are valid. And probably, like in all of these cases, it is meant to be both interpretations. And in the Persian, those both would be very clear to the listener. But in the English, it becomes necessary to explain it.
It's really interesting, Daman. We are interpreting, we've made a conscious decision. When we began the project, I don't think we were that clear. But then as we had Fatima and Nadhra with us, we made that decision that we were going to interpret these ghazals in the genre it was being presented, using that framework instead of trying to fit it into the Gurbani framework. Because, we felt that, Goya is deliberately using this framework of the ghazal and in a language which is an elite language. And so he's writing for people who are knowledgeable and learned. So his audience is of a certain type. And it's, when you write, actually, when I write for myself, but it's basically the people who are lovers understand it, get it. So it is really, you're writing for the lovers. I'm looking at it as Bhai Nand Lal is writing for a certain particular group in mind and not for the masses, because the masses are not going to understand this, this symbolism and these metaphors, because they have to have a lot of education. And keep in mind, this was what, 17th century? So, his choice to deliver his love, to convey his love for the Guru in the language which he chose is not an accident. He's using very symbolic and strong symbolisms of that time to speak to the people who are not maybe of that mindset, of that faith, to say, this is what I'm feeling about this. And I have the skill set to present it in that. And I feel that I hope we are honoring that.
Yeah, I think this is kind of an interesting dilemma because a lot of the scholars have argued that Bhai Nand Lal, and I think I said this earlier, Bhai Nand Lal was primarily, it seems that he was primarily writing to a Sufi audience or a Persian-speaking audience for all of the reasons you pointed to, insofar as this was the language of governance, this was the language of the elites. And then I think it becomes interesting when we're trying to translate, where we as Sikhs today are trying to understand that historical context, which is important to our history, but then also trying to understand what he meant, what these words mean, and how can they help us perhaps understand our own relationship to the Guru. So I think it becomes an interesting thing where there is a particular historical context, a particular audience. All of that is really significant to understanding the text itself. But then the text itself can also be really powerful for all of us, right? And I would say not even just for Sikhs. They're just beautiful poems.
Oh, they are.
Yeah. So I think that it's an interesting thing. And I think, I think I'm always interested in thinking through, okay, like we've done in today's conversation, that there is a particular way this would have been received by his audience in the moment of its writing. And of course, that would, be a whole other conversation. But then there's also what we're trying to do, which is bring his words to, Sikhs in the 21st century, which is just a very different context. And I think, so I think there's that kind of dual way to approach the ghazals that I always try to keep in mind, because I think it's often like, for me personally, I often will read a couplet and say, well, that really resonates with me, or that's really beautiful and powerful, and I want to understand what that means, which is really important. But then as important is the historical context.
Well, everything is about context, isn't it? If you don't understand the context, you don't really get to the depth that you come up with, your own thoughts. Well, this isn't right. This is feminist. This is really, derogatory when it isn't that. I mean, in other things, in here it is using that symbolism of the ruby, which is the lips, and then the fluttering eyes. And, if you wrote that, I mean, people will say, what was he thinking? But these are the symbolism that you have to understand the genre and how he's using it.
And I think also I would say that myself, when I first encountered the ghazals, I was very much struck by some of the very intimate language he's using to describe the beloved. And I think we noted this in the beginning, but in classical Sufi poetry, the beloved would be understood as a female.
Mm-hmm.
And, if we were to translate word for word, we probably would use she or her pronouns to refer to the beloved. And as we noted, we used the word beloved consistently instead of that. But there is a great intimacy. And I think that's part of the beauty, but also part of the power of the ghazals, is that he's using language that might strike us as a bit overly familiar, a bit intimate, a bit confusing. And then I think once you figure out that, oh, this is the tropes he was trying to engage, and also he is describing a very intimate engagement with the Guru that he himself was experiencing, I think it becomes really powerful.
Right. It's been lovely, Daman, having you here and chatting about something which we both are enjoying and loving every moment. And I want to thank our listeners for
Yeah.
joining in. And we hope to bring you another podcast next month. I believe it's Ghazal 8 from the collection, right, Daman?
Yes, that's right.
Anything you would like to say to our listeners before we sign off?
No, I am looking forward to continuing talking with you, Inni, and engaging with people's comments as they begin to experience these ghazals with us.
Thank you. Well, thank you from the both of us. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
You were listening to Sikhcast by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.